The Weight of a Mass, A Tale of Faith, by Josephine Nabisso. Once upon a time, a king betrothed to a queen from a faraway land consented to be married in the cathedral, even though he knew that only a handful of old women would attend the Holy Mass. It was not that his subjects wished the royal couple ill, or that they would not find their own ways of celebrating the union, but the king's people had grown cold and careless in the practice of their faith. A while before the ceremony, a ragged old widow shuffled into the kingdom's most prosperous bake shop. Subjects soaring in high spirits and decked in finery whisked past her, carrying away the finest confections and loaves of bread. The baker lifted elegant pastries and arranged them in lacy boxes upon which he tied jaunty bows. His son, a kindly boy, guarded the royal wedding cake from children's probing fingers, all the while describing how he and his father had erected it. Finally, it was the widow's turn in the crowded shop. "For the love of God," she begged of the baker, "if you will give me a crust of stale bread, I will offer my Mass tonight for you." The baker's son spun on his heels to fetch the bread reserved for the children who fed the royal swans. But his father growled, "This woman shares the disease from which you suffer, and your mother before you. If I didn't keep you busy here, I'd find you on your knees in church with the likes of her." A hush fell over the crowd. The baker peered over the counter. "You propose to hear a Mass for me?" he challenged the old woman. "I'd rather hear the jingle of your coins." "But I haven't a shilling," the widow whispered. "Then I haven't the bread," the baker shot back. "Father," the son protested, "she asked in the name of God." "Then let God provide her bread," the baker exclaimed. The widow turned to leave, but the baker had not finished taunting her. "Let's see how much bread I would owe you," he said. He tore a tiny corner of his finest tissue paper and read aloud as he formed two minuscule words: "One Mass." The baker held up the tiny piece of paper, and with a ceremonious flair he laid the wispy scrap onto the resting tray of his brass scale. He then flicked a slice of old bread onto the other tray. He blinked, confused. The bread side had not dropped to lift the lighter paper. "Impossible!" the baker exclaimed, placing a marzipan apple onto the bread side. Still, the tray holding the paper stayed down. The baker piled layered cake onto the tray, but this did not tip the scale. He stacked his best cherry-topped cupcakes onto the balance, but they did not make the difference. Brushing past his son, he swept heavy-filled chocolates into a box. Still, the scale did not budge when he placed those on it, too. He arranged a dozen poppy seed cakes and 24 rolls onto the pile. "The paper outweighs his goods," a man exclaimed. "The Royal Council of Weights and Measures tested this scale just last week," the baker protested. "Something's gone wrong with it." The baker's son lifted the tiny scrap of paper off the scale, and a gasp went up as the baked goods crashed down with a jangle. Everyone began speaking at once. "What can this mean?" they asked each other. The crowd quieted to watch as the baker emptied the heavy tray and tested the scale with all his weights. Even those smaller than game pieces. The scale responded to every change, floating up and down. "The scale is correct," a woman exclaimed. "Of course it's correct," the baker bellowed. "I am an honest man." Compelled by the event, clients rushed to the doors, calling in more witnesses from the streets. The baker addressed his son. "Pile it high. This time turn the scale around so that the trays are switched." The breads and buns, candies and cakes brought their side down with a satisfying thud. "Now," the baker said as he let the snippet of paper float down toward the new tray, "we'll see the truth." No sooner did the tissue touch the shiny brass tray than it lifted the opposite one. "But I don't understand," the baker muttered as he ran to fetch his finest doughnuts. He piled on fruitcakes and cream cakes, berry tarts and poached pears. "This can't be," he cried as he plastered on plum pudding and candied fruits, almond confetti and crushed walnuts. "The mass intention weighs more than these," the baker's son marveled. The baker was beside himself with bewilderment. He turned to his son. "Don't think I don't know that you would abandon the baking trade to become a priest," he warned. "And don't think any of this will influence me." He took a deep breath. "Bring me the royal wedding cake." As the baker's son rolled the cakes cart through the crowd, it parted, respectful lest the prized confection get damaged. "On the count of 3, the baker ordered his son. "Help me get it onto the scale. This will put an end to the nonsense." 1, 2, 3! The wedding cake teetered on the top of the pile. The paper on which the baker had written the words, one mass, hadn't even fluttered. The baker and his client stood dumbfounded. Just then the cathedral bell began tolling the call to the royal wedding mass. The baker's son stood over the piece of paper, staring at it. When he lifted it from the scale, hands surged forward to rescue the wedding cake as things beneath it crashed down with a mighty clang. A man went out into the street and took up the Ave Maria. The bells were tolling. Other clients who had intended to celebrate the royal wedding in diverse ways now filed out and processed toward the kingdom's great cathedral. One by one they joined the masculine voice in raising the lofty hymn. The stunned baker saw that the only customer left in his shop was the old widow. He made a gesture of putting everything at her disposal. "Come every day," he told her. "You will never grow hungry again." The widow smiled and tucked only a thin slice of bread into her pocket. As the baker watched his son unbutton his white apron, the father sensed that one day the boy would be exchanging it for a white collar. The baker, his son, and the widow trailed the procession to the cathedral to offer Mass with their monarchs. Amidst the singing and the exclamations of wonder and joy, the baker asked the old lady, "Why did you take only a slice when you could have had anything and everything in my shop?" "I was ashamed to take more," the widow told him. "Ashamed?" the baker asked. "But it was you who believed in God's power, while the rest of us had grown cold." "I was ashamed," the widow explained, "because even though I have never given up going to Mass, I asked you only for a crust of stale bread in exchange for it." You see, my friend, like you, I too do not know the weight of a Mass.
A note from the author. Children often ask me where I got the idea for a story. The inspiration to write the original fable, The Weight of a Mass, A Tale of Faith, came in 1998 while reading a piece in the Spirit of Medjugorje newsletter. It recounted the story of a certain Father Stanislaus. In his town in Luxembourg, a conversation between the butcher and the captain of the forest guards was interrupted when an old woman entered the butcher shop to beg a morsel of meat. When the butcher scoffed at the poor woman, she offered to hear Holy Mass in exchange for the meat. The events that transpired then were very similar to what happens in our own story here, which I have set, instead, in a bakery on the day when a king is to marry a queen from a devout kingdom. As a result of the butcher shop miracle, the captain began attending Mass daily, and one of his sons later received a calling to the priesthood. That captain had been Father Stanislaus's own father. The holy sacrifice of the Mass, the Eucharistic celebration, is the priceless source and summit of the Christian life, because in it Christ himself is truly present. In its unfathomably deep richness lies the perfect fulfillment of Jesus' command to repeat his actions and words until he comes.